Okay, so we have learned how natural selection can act on a species, but here let's learn about how we actually get new species that come about. Okay. And so to start off, we need to really have a definition of species. And so we're going to use what's called the biological species concept as our definition. So basically, our definition of a species is that there is a population of organisms whose members can interbreed and they produce viable, fertile offspring. But if they were to breed with something else, they could not produce viable, fertile offspring with members of other groups. Okay, so that basically they can breed and make successful babies. Okay, now one important note is just because members of a species can reproduce doesn't mean they will reproduce, right? Like, think about all of the people that you would never ever want to reproduce with, right? But they're still humans, right? Still part of our species. Biologically, you could, doesn't mean you're gonna choose them. Okay, but we are all still human species. Got it? So, Darwin didn't actually come about, didn't really think about how new species come about. But basically, in order for us to get a new species, there has to be some kind of isolation. Okay, things have to be kind of by themselves for a while until natural selection acts on them for long enough where they become so different where they can't breed with the things they used to be able to breed with. And so now they're their own species. Okay. And so, of course, right, we're talking a lot about making babies. And so a lot of how we get new species are when things no longer can mate. Okay. And so there's going to be kind of two different categories, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Okay. Pre-zygotic are going to be things that are going to keep mating from occurring or keeping fertilization from occurring, right, pre-zygote, before the baby actual forms, whereas post-zygotic are going to be things after the baby forms. So let's start with pre-zygotic barriers, okay? Down here is a huge list of them, and we're going to go through each one of these one by one, okay? So one is habitat isolation, okay? So basically these things, like for example, these water snakes right here, the two types of garter snakes, this one lives on land, this one lives in the water, but they live in the same general area, but they're never going to breed because like the land one doesn't go in the water and the water one doesn't go in the land. Okay. Lion and tiger. Lions live in grasslands and tigers live in the rainforest, but in the same region. But the lion's never going to go in the rainforest and the tiger's never going to go in the grassland. So they are not going to breed. Okay. Pre-zygotic keeps them from making a baby, which Napoleon Dynamite would be very, very sad about. Another type is called temporal isolation, basically where it has to do with nocturnal versus not nocturnal, different times of season or year. And so here are two different kinds of skunks, okay? The eastern spotted skunk mates in the late winter, and the western mates in the late summer. So even if the eastern and the western, wherever their ranges overlap, these two will never breed because they don't mate at the same time of the year. Another one is called behavioral isolation, and this typically revolves around different courtship rituals. And so different, there are different things that different species do to attract a mate, and birds are really good ones. So I'm going to show you some of my favorites. They are the blue-footed booby. Okay, they live in the Galapagos Islands, and so let's take a look here at them. They're so cute and ridiculous, you guys. So this right here, that little like walk-in high step thing, that is their mating dance part of it, okay? They start picking their legs up, their feet up. They just kind of pick their feet up. And if the lady likes it, ooh, she does, then she lifts her feet back up in response. And now they both kind of sit there and they lift their feet up. And so this is probably going to go well for this male because the lady is picking her feet up, okay? And then they start doing this thing with their necks and they raise their beaks up. And I know it doesn't look like very much to us. Oh, yes, you look at that. Oh, now they're getting into it. Yeah. Oh, we like what we see. Okay, so these two are probably going to mate. They're not going to show the mating here, but they are going to mate. And as it turns out, there's other types. The species is called a blue-footed booby. There are masked boobies and red-footed boobies. I know, I just said booby a whole lot. And they all live in the same area. But the other types don't respond to this dance. The red-footed boobies are like, yawn, next. So this will keep them from breeding with the other birds, even on the same islands. Another one is called mechanical isolation. This one gets a little technical. So let's start with the least cringeworthy. Here are two different types of monkey flowers, but they produce different appearance. They have different appearances, which in different shapes that are going to attract different pollinators. Okay. So then they won't interbreed because they have to be pollinated. That's their breeding. With snails, as it turns out, like their reproductive organs come out of the side of their body, and it has to do with which direction their shells spiral. And so these two poor star-crossed lovers are trying to mate, but their reproductive organs are on opposite sides of their body, so they're never going to be able to match up their bits. Okay. And then down here, this is slightly terrifying. These are 4 different penis shapes of damselfly species. So you can only mate with a damselfly that has the matching anatomy shape to your anatomy shape. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. The last type of pre-zygotic barrier is called gametic isolation. This has to do with the gametes, right? Sperm and eggs. So basically, either the sperm can't fertilize the egg because it physically can't get in, or the sperm dies as soon as it enters the female's reproductive tract. And so here are some sea urchins. I love sea urchins. And there's red and purple, obviously. And these are 2 different species because, so when they mate, they just release their sperm and their eggs into the ocean. And as it turns out, the red and purple sperm and eggs can't fertilize. It doesn't work. So they're different species. Let's talk about some post-zygotic barriers, okay? So they were able to reproduce and make a baby, but the offspring are feeble, they're sickly, they are not able to reproduce or can't like keep going generation after generation, okay? So here's an example where a baby is made, but it ends up being not really very strong. This is called reduced hybrid viability. Okay, a hybrid is just the offspring that results from 2 different species mating. And so here's a salamander that was made from 2 different species of salamanders, but this salamander is going to be weak and is never going to fully develop. Okay, reduced hybrid fertility means the hybrid that's made is physically healthy, but they're not going to be able to have babies. And so this is where we get mules. Okay, a mule is the baby of a horse and a donkey, but mules are sterile. They can't ever have babies. And here's why. Horse has 64 chromosomes, donkeys have 62. Therefore, mules have 63 chromosomes. And if you remember from meiosis, things need to pair up. And so with that odd number, they're not going to be able to go through meiosis right and make proper gametes. So mules are sterile. They can't have kids. Okay. The last kind is they're able to make a baby, but it can't keep going for generations. Okay. And so an example here is wild rice. So if you have 2 different species of wild rice and they mate, the babies are fine. But then when the babies start having babies, then the next generation is weak. And then eventually they get to be sterile where they can't keep going by themselves anymore. Okay. So that's all reproductive isolation. That could be pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. There's 2 other types of isolation that we want to cover. Okay, one is called allopatric speciation. And this is where species become separated because of some kind of physical barrier. So the way I remember this is like these 2 L's in allopatric almost looks like you're breaking the word in 2. Okay, so like here, if there's some lizards and then some of them salamanders, excuse me. If some of them get stuck on one side of a mountain range and some of them get stuck on the other side of a mountain range, and if they're separated for long enough, these ones are just going to breed together and these ones are going to breed together. And if they ever come back together, they won't mate. They just won't. Okay. Your book has some other examples of this too. But the thing with allopatric is they are geographically isolated from each other. Okay. They didn't used to be, but now they are. It could be a river popping up. It could be a lake kind of drying up with that becomes like 2 lakes. Okay. That isolates fish in either lake, stuff like that. The other type is sympatric speciation. Now, with allopatric, we had a physical barrier here. With sympatric, nope. They all live in the same geographic area. But basically, maybe because they prefer a different habitat, or maybe because they like a certain coloration, they're just not going to interbreed. Okay, so maybe these are like little flies here, and then maybe these flies like to live in the open water, and these flies like to live in the grass. And as it turns out that like only grass flies mate with grass, and open water flies mate with open water, and then over time they will become so separate that they won't ever breed together anymore. Again, your book gives lots more examples here too. Okay, so now we know that like how they can come about, right? Which is also to do with isolation. Here's when it happens. There's two different schools of thought. One is called gradualism, which is saying that, hey, always species are gradually changing at a very, very slow rate, but they're just changing a little bit by little bit every generation. The other kind of model is punctuated equilibrium, which says that basically like big, huge changes happen typically right after mass extinctions, and we see lots of new species come about, and then they just kind of chill and hang out where they are. Okay. Um, so those are the two kind of theories that scientists think, and there's not necessarily one right answer, but those are the two possibilities that they've come up with. So here are the main highlights of what we just covered in this lecture, and this is all found in chapter 22 of your textbook.